YouTube, this is Taz 101 Saga. Of course you all know that by now. We're going to get into this thing, but first, we need to get legalities out of the way, don't we? Whoa, a British guy with a machine gun, what's going on? Well, I'm afraid this is Birmingham Proof House Mark deactivated light machine gun. Sorry Americans, won't be shooting any exploding targets in this video. This is just part of the government's overall plan to outlaw everything that's fun. Right, before we get our head stuck in the history of this weapon, I've got some shout outs. Number 1, Harry Williams. Number 2, Josh Sapsford, as always. Number 3, Alfie Bowers. Right guys, what you are looking at is a Russian DP28 light machine gun. DP is Degtyaryov Model. Not sure if I'm saying that right. Although it's called the DP28, this weapon originally came from another weapon designed by Soviet Degtyaryov, which was officially adopted into trials in 1927 as the DP27. Now the reason for that was the Russians for quite some time, mainly since 1924-25, were trying to develop a sort of light machine gun which could be used on the move. Their inspiration, as I imagine it, came from the German MG0815, which was basically a lightened version of their MG08 Maxim water-cooled machine gun they used in the First World War. It was partially successful, though it was still pretty heavy because you still needed to carry all the water, all the ammunition obviously because it's belt fed, 250 rounds belt staggered up in a big ammo box, so it was all quite cumbersome and heavy. The Russians tried a similar thing in 1925. They took their M1910 Maxim and they made attempts to lighten it much in the same fashion as the Germans did with the MG08. And I don't know the actual specs on it, it's a hard thing to find out about, but it was called the Maxim Tokarev. It was a success partially. It was more lightweight and was easier to carry in the same fashion as the Germans did with the MG08 than the original Maxim gun, which weighs a lot when it's on a Sokolov wheeled mount. What they basically got their inspiration partially from this gun was the British Lewis gun. The British Lewis gun actually entered Russia in about 1917, according to their records. Some of them were still being used in, reserve units of small numbers right up into the Second World War. Once this gun came in, they kind of put the Lewis to the background. So because the Lewis was, they were getting it from this country, so they wanted a domestically produced gun. Vasily Degtyaryov popped up with his DP27, later adopted as this, the DP28, once some little refinements were done. This weapon was far superior to the most of the competition actually, and in the prototype stage they buried this weapon in mud, and it was still able to fire over 500 rounds without extensive cleaning, so that's pretty impressive. Although to go along with traditional Russian thinking, this gun was a winner because it only took about 150 man-hours to produce. That's component production and assembly time in total, so it's about 150 man-hours. The Maxim M1910 was nearly 700 man-hours total production time for components and assembly, so that was a long time. This was a weapon which is much more suitable for advancing. The Maxim's a much better defensive gun than an offensive gun for obvious reasons, and this is a much better offensive gun than defensive gun, so it filled a little niche that the Russians really needed. The first major large-scale use of this gun was in the war between Russia and Finland, also known as the Winter War, or Talvisota in the Finnish language. By the time the continuation war was coming to an end in September 1944 between Russia and Finland, the Finns were actually fielding significantly more DP28s than they were their own light machine gun, which was the LS26, which was produced by Lahti in Finland. The main reason that soldiers preferred the DP28 was mainly because it was just simply better firepower for the weight. The LS26 was quite cumbersome and heavy. This gun's sort of cumbersome, but it had over double the magazine capacity, which is always an advantage to have more rounds. The LS26 had a 20 round box magazine which was mounted underneath, and 20 rounds doesn't always cut it. So they much preferred this gun. It was also extremely reliable in cold weather because all Russian weapons to a good degree are designed to work in very cold temperatures, as is common in Russia. There were some complaints about the LS26 being difficult to maintain because it had a hell of a lot of parts. These guns have generally fewer than 80 parts. It differs slightly as the progression of the guns went on. The early guns have, slightly different number of parts to the later ones. The DP was easier to use than the Lati, it was lighter in weight and much larger magazine capacity, and in the Winter War the Finns actually captured massive stocks of Soviet ammunition from airdrops, which was meant for the Red Army, but they actually copied, ingenious actually, they copied the Red Army's airdrop signals, so the Russian Air Force was actually dropping ammo supplies on Finnish troops. So they made plenty of advantage of Russian Mosin-Nagants, DP28s, and basically any other Russian gun they could get their hands on. DP saw a lot of use in the Finnish-Russian conflict, although its single largest use was against the Germans in the Great Patriotic War, or the Eastern Front segment of the Second World War. This is designed to be a squad-level machine gun, so it'd either be 1 or 2 per squads. They actually increased the number of these carried per battalion from about 1943 onwards. The main reason for that was they were advancing and they needed to keep up with the immense firepower of the German MG34 and 42s. This gun was seen to be a bit of a disadvantage against the German machine guns, particularly the MG34 in the early stages. Although one advantage it did have over the MG34 was it's far simpler to maintain in rigorous conditions. When the Germans launched Barbarossa, the Soviet army was obviously in disarray because Stalin's purges of the 30s had killed off all the good commanders, we all know about that. And Russian army after Russian army just became encircled in pincer movements by the Germans, and because of that, when they surrendered, the Germans took hundreds of thousands of prisoners very early on in the war, and because of that they lost a lot of their equipment. So to cut corners on how much equipment they lost and the fact they suddenly needed to arm thousands of troops with weapons, they slightly reduced the quality of these guns so they could get production numbers out. Since it's magazine fed and not belt fed, it's a lot easier to carry around without having a big belt dangling, and the MG34 and the 42, because they fed off usually up to a 250 round belt in an ammo box, the Germans would often unload them before they sprinted off to a new position. It's just much easier, and it takes a long time to dangle a belt over your arm before you can move, so they used to unload them. Good thing with this gun is you don't have to unload it and reload it as you move, because the magazine sits on top. And as long as you weren't, firing the crap out of it and melting the barrel, it was a very good gun in the offensive role. And in some ways proved to be almost equal to the MG34 in winter conditions, mainly because it just worked so much better in cold weather. The lack of a belt feed also meant that it could be fired inside buildings without, it getting snagged on anything. Particularly if you're running in buildings which have been bombed out, so things are going to be sticking out crudely everywhere. It's not going to be all neat walled and everything, so there's a lot more things that a belt on a belt-fed machine gun could snag on in all the chaos of cramped, smoky interior of a building. The weapon also saw a lot of use by partisans, of course. They would basically just use any gun they could get hold of, Russian or German or some other nationality. The Germans used them in small numbers as well. The Germans are quite known for making use of captured weapons. Probably their most favourite Russian weapon of the German army to capture was the PPSH-41 submachine gun, because in a lot of soldiers' opinions it was far superior to the MP38 and MP40 German submachine guns. So the Germans made quite a good use of the DP in certain scenarios. The simplicity of the DP means that practically anyone could be trained to use it within an hour. It was a very easy weapon to strip down. It's a bit awkward in some places, you can do it tools free, but it does help to have tools to strip it down, but overall it's very easy to strip down and maintain. At the end of the war, particularly in the Battle of Berlin and Seelow Heights, when the German army was sort of being ground down rapidly to its inevitable defeat in Berlin, the Red Army was advancing at speed, and the Germans were arming the Volkssturm, which was the German People's Army. It's kind of their version of the British Home Guard. The Volkssturm was in serious disarray, actually, and they almost did nothing to stop the advance of the Red Army, especially once they entered the suburbs of Berlin and pushed onto the Reichstag. The average Volkssturm fighter was only carrying about 20 rounds of ammunition, on average for a bolt-action rifle, and probably only slightly more or less for a weapon like this, so they did practically nothing to stop the Russian assault. The Volkssturm was not really given the latest and greatest stuff. That was given to what was left of the German army, and of course the Waffen-SS got all the best stuff. The Volkssturm were just given anything, and I've heard stories of the fact that they were being supplied with rifles, with so many different rifles, that whoever was running the logistics, it was an absolute nightmare for them to get all these different types of ammunition for all these rifles. So was an absolute fail. Of course, none of this was a problem for the Red Army, who by that point, at the war's end, they had almost 600,000 DPs that had been manufactured. So they had hundreds of thousands of these things and millions of rounds of ammunition. They used these guns to their full potential in the Second World War on the Eastern Front, and although they did have some problems, they definitely did very well overall. Once the Second World War was over, Degtyaryov, even before the war was over actually, had designed a machine gun which was originally designated the M44, although it was more commonly known as the RPD. The RPD was probably a slightly better weapon than this. It was belt fed with a 100 round drum magazine which held a coiled up belt of 7.62 by 39 underneath. So it had a lot more firepower than this gun. So it eventually replaced the DP entirely, although this gun was produced in various countries right up until the 1960s. North Korea fielded a huge amount of these. It was their standard light machine gun actually. Their standard issue weapons were practically all Russian: the Mosin Nagant rifle, the PPSH, PPS, DP, the Maximum 1910 SG-43s, all the Russian weapons that were used in World War II, which was eventually all being replaced by the Russians. The Russians just gave them piles. As did the Chinese. They received a lot of Russian weapons, although they mostly just copied them and produced their own. They produced this weapon, the DP, in China, which was used in the Chinese Civil War by the PLA, which was the communist side. That was from 1946 to 1950, and as I said, in the Korean War, which was from 1950 to 1953 when the ceasefire was declared. So this gun saw a lot of use after World War II. Also went on to be used in slightly less numbers by the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army, especially the Viet Cong, who just sort of used any guns they could really get hold of. They still see use today with guerrilla forces. There have been a few of them spotted in the hands of the Taliban. Bad Taliban. And basically, they're still used today in a lot of places, mainly because the ammunition is plentiful. There were many different variants of this gun manufactured from the war era, the pre-war era actually, from the war to the post-war era, so there's a whole number of different versions of these. And I'm going to spend a fair bit of time talking about those later once we go from butt to muzzle. From what I've seen, there seem to be almost no videos on YouTube which actually go into the DP28 light machine gun in depth, so it's my pleasure to be the first one to do that, as far as I know. So, butt to muzzle time. So we'll start at the butt. This one is just made of very, simple plywood. It's not particularly high quality, but it's still perfectly robust. There's nothing damaged about it. It doesn't even have a butt plate. It's just plain wood. There's no metallic butt plate at all. This right here is a bore brush, which is attached just via simple screw threads on top, inside the stock. All you do is unscrew it, and you have simple access to a bore brush right there. And you just got your little wire bristles on the end. Put some solvent, and once you've got your barrel out, go in your chamber and give that a good scrub to get all the carbon out. The DP28 trigger group technically has no particular safety on it. There's also no selector for single shot or automatic or burst fire. It fires in full automatic only. The only safety you really do have is this grip safety. It functions pretty similar to the way the 1911 beaver tail safety does. You can't depress the trigger all the way unless you also depress this grip safety right here. What that basically does is the other side of this will block the trigger from being moved, so it literally just blocks the back of the trigger inside the gun. The idea of that is if the trigger is accidentally hit on something, you're not going to fire a round off unless you're actually holding the gun that way. One thing I've actually seen Russian troops doing is sometimes when they shoulder the weapon, they actually depress the grip safety with one hand and then fire with their other hand around it, like that. I've seen them doing that in some instances because some of these can be quite stiff. Mine's not terribly stiff and you can do it quite easily, but still it feels like you're having to squeeze that unnaturally hard to actually pull it. There's a famous piece of archive footage, if anyone has seen the young Russian guy with blonde hair who's firing at the guys that have jumped out of the tank. He's quite evidently doing that with his hands to squeeze that. The rear sight has a pretty standard setup as far as adjustment goes. It's graduated from 100 to 1500 meters. Just exactly the same way as most sights like the Mauser or the Mosin Nagant rear sights that just slide on a ramp. You got a button on each side, you just depress that and you can adjust it to any point you want. When it's on its maximum setting, 1500 meters up there, which was the maximum range that you would generally engage a target on paper. Although the practical range of this weapon in combat conditions, you're looking at 300 to 500 meters. This is your basic DP sighting arrangement, as in a point of view perspective. Just lines up with a simple U-notch at the back. Pretty simple sighting system. One of the most peculiar things about the DP28 is probably the method of releasing the magazine. These two ears, which also act as a sight protector around the rear sight, it's all a one-piece unit. There's little serrations on the side for you to grab your thumb and forefinger, and you simply pull that and that will release this little catch at the back. You can see it moving back there. Then you can lift off the magazine. It also slots in at the front. So it's slightly odd, although it's probably much easier to do than the Lewis gun. It's much easier to do with an assistant gunner if they're laying alongside you. Someone simply pulls on the magazine release and then your gunner would just lift off on the magazine. But it's quite a peculiar affair than what we'd be used to on most modern firearms. The magazine is quite an interesting point of the weapon. It's also one of the downsides. They're particularly heavy and somewhat cumbersome, as the way they're mounted on the gun means that, particularly when they're loaded, they're quite heavy. They weigh well over, 2 or 3 pounds when they're actually loaded up. They hold 47 rounds of 7.62 by 54R, which was the standard Russian cartridge used in all their rifle caliber weapons. The rounds are actually pointed, the bullet heads are always pointed to the centre of the magazine. This ring here is where the bullet's head would be touching. These indentations are what the rounds will be sat in, so it holds 47 rounds in total, and they'll all be pointing to the middle like that. So the magazine's somewhat cumbersome, bit of an odd design. The Russians wanted to keep the same cartridge as the Mosin Nagant for logistical reasons. Probably would have been easier in my opinion if they stuck to a box magazine mounted on top like they did with the Bren gun. The British Bren is a far easier gun to reload than this, and the magazines are far superior on the Bren to this weapon. There's a number of different magazines for this gun actually. Well, not a number, but there is more than just the magazine you're looking at, which is the standard magazine 47 round mag used on the infantry configuration of this gun, the DP28. Every variant of the DP light machine gun, as far as I'm aware of, has a milled receiver. I've never seen any with any rivets on for a start. That's quite unusual considering it's a Russian weapon that was produced in large numbers during the Second World War. When they were producing, PPSH 41 submachine guns, PPS 43 submachine guns, entirely out of stampings. The receiver is also, as with most firearms, where you will find the date. I'll give you a close-up of that. At the top of the trigger mechanism housing where it joins to the receiver, you will find your basic serial number. My particular one is KW361. You'll find matching serial numbers, in theory, should be on the butt and on the receiver itself. Located behind the rear sight and magazine release on top of the receiver, you'll find the date, the manufacturer's symbol, which is located above the 1944, but it doesn't really stand out on camera. My particular one looks to be made at Ishevsk, as what I can best make out, it's an Ishevsk symbol. You have the date here, 1944, and underneath you should have a serial number, hopefully matching to all the other numbers on the rest of the gun. This is the little part which is bolted on top of the barrel jacket to hold the front of the magazine. The front of the magazine has these two ears, and they basically kind of slot in under there. This is where some of the difficulty of loading in battle comes, as you can't load it there or on top. It's got to be exactly in the right spot, otherwise it won't go in. The cocking handle on the DP28, which is here, is very, very basic. It does reciprocate with the gun, and when the action is cycling, you don't want to put your hand anywhere under this point, which is also where the ejection port is. So not only will you get smacked in the hand by a very fast moving cocking handle, you also get a handful of hot brass, which you don't want either. The handle itself is very simple. It doesn't fold inwards or upwards or anything, it's just where it is. It's not like the MG42 where when you cock it you can return it back forward, so it's a slight of a downside. The idea is it's just to keep production simple. Visible from the top of the receiver with no magazine attached obviously is the bolt, which is situated up here. That's the start of the piston there, which we'll show more of in the disassembly section. You can release the action by simply holding on to the cocking handle and depressing the grip safety and depressing the trigger to release the bolt all the way forward. The barrel jacket has a series of vent holes all around it which allow the DP to be cooled by air, as it's an air-cooled weapon. Another advantage of this is if you're fighting in winter conditions, because a lot of the barrel is exposed due to these holes, you can just pick snow up and just pack snow around it to keep it cool, which was often done by the Russians, who would just cover the thing in snow after a long firefight. This weapon could fire for decent amounts of time, although you generally were better off firing less than 2 magazines per minute for under 10 minutes to prevent the barrel from being damaged. The Russians, as far as I'm aware of, didn't really carry spare barrels on a regular basis. It's not something that was part of general practice. When the barrel gets hot, there's a lot of space for, the heat of the barrel to escape out of the jacket. The Russians often had a lot of interesting ideas for barrel jackets as far as winter conditions went. You'll quite commonly see on the M1910 Maxim they introduced a snow cap during the war, so you could basically just open it on the jacket and pack snow in if you ran out of water. And the heat of the barrel would obviously just melt that into water anyway, so it's quite an interesting concept. You do not want to put your hand up there if you just fired a bunch of ammo, regardless. If you're not thinking properly, you don't have a glove on and you grab that, that's going to hurt. This can get hot too, so you don't want to touch that too much. If you're wearing a glove, it's probably okay, but what I've seen from most archive footage is Russian troops that aren't wearing gloves, or even ones that are, tend to grab the left bipod leg if they're right-handed, and obviously vice versa for the other. So that's generally where you want to grab the gun. The DP machine gun has an adjustable gas regulator, which is here, and this is the gas port. This is located under the front sight and is part of the main barrel assembly. And then you can adjust the gas system. I'm not sure how many settings it has, but it's quite a few. And you can turn it right up to a very high setting if you're in very dirty or adverse conditions. It basically just allows more gas to be recycled at higher pressures to keep the gun working more reliably, and if it's dirty, So that's the main advantage of that. The front sight is just a basic single post with protectors around it. To adjust the front sight for windage, basically just loosen this and you can drift the front sight left or right. If the gun's not zeroed properly, then you can use this to adjust the point of aim to correspond with the point of impact. There's also a tool which is part of the standard DP maintenance kit which you can use to adjust the front sight post for elevation. Adjusting the bipod can be simpler. There's no actual spring mechanism in this at all. It's just held under tension by a little wire spring which is wrapped around the back of the screw which holds the leg in. So they do have some tension. You can just fold them in easily, and broken bipods will not fold up. They'll just flop everywhere, and a lot of them are broken. This one's not, however, because this bipod's in very good condition and it works perfectly. This is as far forward as the legs could go. The bipod doesn't have conventional feet as such, as most other machine guns do. It's just a simple pointed assembly which allows it to, dig into the dirt or the snow to give it more solid footing. The left bipod leg is equipped much like the right, but with the addition of this little hook. The idea of this is meant to be on the inside of the gun. When you fold the legs up under the jacket, this essentially just clips over the main part of the leg on the right bipod leg, and that will hold them together underneath the gun. The muzzle area is very basic. You just have a large conical flash hider which is screwed on by standard threads onto the barrel itself. There were two different types of DP barrels for the infantry model, the DP28. There were some fin barrels made. They basically had fins inside the barrel jacket area, but they were smooth on this portion. I've seen quite a few with finned barrels, although from what I can tell, the smooth barrels are more common and what were produced throughout the war. They stopped making the fin barrels just to speed up production because it's a lot quicker to make a smooth barrel than a finned one, of course. The DP28 has two basic sling points. You've got one up the front which is attached to the left side of the barrel jacket. Rear sling point is exactly the same setup. It's attached to the buttstock and is held in by two screws, so it's easy to remove if it breaks for whatever reason. That really isn't going to break under field conditions though. You have an adjustable belt here which you can adjust anywhere up to 5 different slots. The sling also has a shoulder pad which can be adjusted just simply by pulling it. You don't even have to undo anything, it's just held in by these 3 leather tabs and you can just adjust it to any point. Quite a nice feature, I like that. This is one of the 2 different methods of magazine carriage that was used by infantry with the DP machine gun. This is a canvas magazine pouch. There was also a steel magazine box. This was just easier to produce and lighter weight than carrying a metallic box, which would add weight to the already heavy 3 magazines inside. So to open it, it's just a basic belt and buckle, unslot that, and then you have access to your 3 magazines which are all located inside. They're a bit awkward to get out as they're held in by metal clips on both sides and underneath to stop them falling out if the thing comes undone. But with some practice you could pull those out real quick. This particular satchel, you probably won't be able to see, but it's got Russian arsenal markings and it's dated 1943 right there. But this is basically what they carry magazines in. The assistant gunner would carry one of these, so they'd refill those magazines. Once you've used a magazine, the assistant gunner, whilst the gunner's firing, would be sticking the empty one back in or discarding it or whatever they had to do in that situation. So these things are pretty heavy, and this one's unloaded, and that is a fair weight. When these things are loaded, they'll weigh even more, so that you're looking at a good 10 or more, at least 10 or more pounds when this thing is loaded up. This is some heavy gear to carry around. These things were one of the main downsides of the DP, mainly because they're just so cumbersome and awkward to load. But I will try my very best to do this from this very awkward angle working around the tripod camera. Basically, this whole assembly is wound up by a clockwork spring in the centre. You can see the whole thing rotates. First thing you have to do is just, the follower is like a fake cartridge case in there. First thing you have to do is make sure that is moving properly. So then you drop your first round in, and your second, and then your third. Make sure it goes in properly though, like so. And you load in your third round, and you can repeat that process up to 47 times. So very awkward and cumbersome to do, especially when you're trying to work around a camera tripod. In the field it must have been a nightmare if you had to do that in battle. Loaded the DP itself is quite simple. Simply slot the front of the magazine in, as I showed from the POV, smack the back, and then cock the weapon and you're good to go. You can also cock it before you load the magazine. It doesn't matter if you do it before or after, but this has to be back before you can fire the gun. The DP28, like most Russian weapons at the time, is chambered in the 7.62 by 54R. This round is a fully rimmed cartridge case, much like the 303 British. This is a very potent cartridge. In the DP it has a muzzle velocity of about 2700 feet per second, give or take a few depending on how hot the ammunition is, of course. Most common weapon you'll find this in today is the SVD Dragunov sniper rifle, designated marksman rifle more accurately, and the Russian PKM general purpose machine gun. It first came out in 1891. It was used in the Mosin Nagant family of rifles. Practically every variant of that has been chambered in this. It's sort of the universal Russian round, and it's been produced for over 120 years now. So it's actually the longest serving military cartridge and one of the longest manufactured cartridges in history, alongside the .22 LR. This round has really been around, and millions of these have been fired in wars absolutely everywhere. First step, easiest thing is to take off the bipod. Just unscrew that at the top. That comes off very easily and flips down to the side. Open the cap. That removes. There's your whole bipod off. Second thing, you have a screw on the side here, which is attached to the receiver. Once you've got that out, that comes down. Buttstock is pretty stiff to get off, so I'm going to do that off camera. Right, once you've loosened up the buttstock, just give it a nice whack. Try not to bang the table too hard. That brings off your buttstock and your trigger mechanism housing assembly. After that, you just turn the gun upside down. You want to remove the working parts. Just use a flathead or something. They're just held in by a simple catch which you can flip up. Get it started, turn the gun up all the way, and you can withdraw the working parts and the action out of the rear. And as far as the basic teardown, you can't strip the barrel on this because it's a post-95 new spec, so the barrel's welded to the receiver. Your bolt then just jumps off your carrier, very simply like that. Firing pin drops out the back. Get your two wedges come out the side there. That's your buttstock. Here you've got the bolt and the two locking wedges I told you about. That's the firing pin, the front of which has of course been removed for deactivation purposes. Basic buttstock, you have a screw which holds them together, your bolt carrier, your piston and your recoil spring assembly, magazine, upper receiver, jacket, barrel, and of course the bipod. Bolt grip itself is very simple. Reassembling it couldn't be easier. You just slide in the wedges. They'll only go in one way, so you can't do it wrong. Then you insert the firing pin, side with the serial number, up first. that just hops straight in. Get your carrier, there's a little slot for the back of the firing pin, and that just sits in nicely, just like that. When the piston travels all the way forward, obviously the bolt and the cartridge on the front of it will hit the face of the chamber, and that will cause it to, the little cams on the inside of the firing pin here. In fact, I can show you that more easily if I just quickly remove it. You can see there's two little cams, slope surfaces, and what those do, when they contact the inside of the wedges, they force it to move out. So you can see there, that's the full locking action. When the round is chambered, that'll jump back and lock it into the receiver. There's little cams on the inside of the bolt carrier there, which will then slide them back inwards on the way out. So very, very simple mechanism, but very interesting, and it works very, very well. It's been used in a lot of weapons. The lower assembly buttstock trigger mechanism housing is very simply, here's your sear. It doesn't move all the way down unless you depress the grip safety. That sear basically catches on the underside of the bolt carrier. There's a little flat edge which that will slot in over. So very, very simple mechanism. Nothing that can really go wrong on it. The inside of the receiver is extremely open, so you can literally just get your whole hand in there. It's extremely easy to clean it. There's the spring-loaded ejector, and this is where the ejection port would be. And a nice weld there where they block the chamber. This essentially isn't really a gas tube as such, it's more just where the piston is located, and of course it comes out to contact the gas port there. This little part here where it's been machined away at the side is so the gas port can twist 45 degrees, which is when you depress the barrel release mechanism, which is this. Moves out a wedge on the other side, which you can see there, although it's been welded so you can't remove the barrel. But normally you just depress this button and then you'd be able to twist the barrel 45 degrees and then it would just slide forward and straight out of the gun for easy replacement. As good as the DP may have been in its day, it was far from perfect. No weapon's perfect, but this one is fairly far from perfect, I think that's fair to say. Very, very good, solid, reliable weapon, but there were three problems with it. We'll start with magazines then. Magazines, as I've already demonstrated, are very awkward to load. It does get easier with more practice, although they're a little bit fragile anyway. If you just listen to the sound of them, they're quite tinny sounding. I mean, it's not like you drop the thing and it would smash into 6 pieces. Because the top is quite thin, if you smash it with, bang on something, it could cause a stoppage whenever it gets to that part of the magazine as the top is rotating when you're firing. So that was one disadvantage of the magazine. The gun itself is not very heavy. It weighs 20 pounds unloaded with no magazine attached, and about 25 pounds with a loaded magazine on. Second gripe is probably the bipod. The bipod was half the reason they changed it. Well, actually was the reason they changed the bipod when the DPM came out in the late war period. They changed the bipod on the DPM because the original on here is just a little flimsy. It's not the sort of thing that will stand up to masses of field abuse being smacked about. One measure that Russian troops did in the field, it was a field modification. I've seen a few of these around. They've actually taken an MG34 and MG42 bipod, which is quite similar, and they've welded the legs from a 42 bipod to the bracket, the bipod bracket on this gun. I personally totally understand why they did that, because it's much stronger, robust legs than this. The biggest disadvantage for the whole design, however, which is also why they brought out the DPM variant, which we'll talk about in a minute, was the location of the recoil spring on this gun. Now, as I showed you in the disassembly section, it's actually wrapped around the piston, which is located in this portion here, underneath the barrel. The main disadvantage of that is when the barrel heats up, the heat, because it's so close, the heat will spread to the piston, which is located underneath the gun, and since the spring is wrapped around it, let's face it, springs are not exactly thick, so it will eventually lose its tension. What this could do is reduce the rate of fire of the gun to a point where it was so low that the spring wasn't even strong enough to reliably drive around out of the magazine into the chamber because of how flimsy it had become from heat damage. It's a bit of a disadvantage if your gun suddenly craps out on you in the middle of a battle and you have a DP that doesn't work. Although when these guns had good springs, undamaged magazines, they would work just endlessly. Let's talk about some different variants of the gun then. I'll stick a picture up as I'm going. The main variant, besides the standard infantry model that was introduced for infantry use, was introduced in 1944, late 1944. The Red Army adopted a new variant called the DPM, which was basically Degtyaryov modernised. The idea behind it was to fix some of the problems which existed on this model. The main thing they did was they moved the location of the recoil spring to the rear of the gun. That's why in the picture you'll see like an extension behind, and they added a pistol grip. And the bipod was also changed to a more solid fix so it wouldn't break so easily, so the bipod was much better on the DPM. The main variant that was used for armoured fighting vehicles and tanks was known as the DT29, or Degtyaryov Tankon. It was designed to be used in armoured vehicles. It was commonly seen on light armoured cars like the Russian BA-64 and in the hull of a coaxial gun of tanks like the T-34, 76 and 85. A bipod could be attached to it further back, which was an advantage because if the crew had to bail out of the vehicle, they could actually take a gun with them, fit the bipod, and then they had a light machine gun. So that versatility gave crews a much better chance than just being armed with a Nagant or a Tokarev revolver or pistol when they jumped out. Standard magazine like this, as you notice, it's relatively flat, thin in profile. What they wanted to do for vehicles was increase the capacity, so they managed to up it to, I think it was about 60 or 63 rounds, probably 60 rounds. The magazine was actually narrower, it wasn't so, the diameter was less, should I say, and the height was extended. Because the height was extended, they had to change the rear sights and the front sights. They had slightly elevated sights you could see over the magazine. DTs mounted in T-34 hull guns and coaxial guns also were fitted with a brass catcher which attached to the underneath so you can catch the shells so you don't have them rolling and bouncing around inside the confines of the vehicle. In the BA-64, for example, they could carry up to 1,300 rounds of ammunition in the 60 round magazine, so that's a fair decent amount of firepower. The DTs used on the coaxial mount, for example like on the T-34, 76 or 85 tank, they'd have it alongside the main gun, usually on the right side. And the gun could be fired obviously wherever the main armament of the tank was pointing, so that gave you like a full 360-degree arc of fire for the DT on a tank turret. There was also an aircraft version known as the DA, simply Degtyaryov aircraft, whatever that is in Russian. That was manufactured between 1928 and 1930. It was eventually replaced in 1933 by the SHKAS machine gun. A total of 1,200 of them were manufactured, and in the early years they were mounted on the early variants of bombers like the Tupolev TB3 I think. They had a number of those on the fuselage as defensive guns against attacking fighters. They were also mounted in the wings of Polikarpov R5 fighters and PO2 fighters and fighter bombers, things like that. But it was mainly used as a defensive armament on bombers. From 1946 onwards, the Red Army began manufacturing and slightly adopting a new variant of the DP, which was actually a belt-fed conversion. It was fed by a standard 7.62 by 54 arm metallic belt as used in the Maxim and later the PKM general purpose machine gun. It was basically called the RP46 or the company machine gun. Had a much thicker barrel as well, and it could be fired, up to 500 rounds could be fired on sustained fire rate, that's less than 100 rounds a minute, before it needed to be changed, so it was a much thicker barrel. And many of them have been seen in recent conflicts, mainly because the ammunition is compatible with the PKM, which is basically everywhere. They added a new gas regulator, I think it was a 3-position gas regulator, and that was a bit more reliable and a bit simpler than the one on this gun, and it was more effective and easy to adjust. It was also copied in China as the Type 58 and North Korea as the Type 64, so the RP46 was well used as well. But this is the basics, will always be known as the basic Degtyaryov DP design, because this is what saw service in a number of wars, right from the Russo-Finnish War, the Winter War, up to the Continuation War, World War II, Korea, China, Vietnam, parts of Asia. It's been practically everywhere, including the Middle East. And so it's a fantastic weapon. Despite its flaws, it's done extremely well, and it's been used practically everywhere. But it's mostly known for its use in the Second World War, of course. And if you watch a lot of archive footage of the Russians, you'll see plenty of guys running around with these, which is why it's amazing for me to own such a good piece of history like this. This particular one was made in 1944, as I showed, and so there's a strong chance it could have been used in World War II because they needed every weapon they could get. I'll definitely get a video out on a more detailed disassembly with close-ups on how to take this thing down, because that's something that YouTube seems to lack. There's not many videos on this gun at all on YouTube, as far as tabletop reviews, etc. So feel free to rate, comment, subscribe. I've really enjoyed making this video. Thanks very much for watching. Any questions are welcome. So thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you soon.